Kirsty Williams, CBE, who until very recently was the Education Minister in the Welsh Government and had been since May 2016. She was elected to the Senedd in 1999 and was leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats from 2008 to 2016, and then subsequently in an acting capacity in 2017. So has been very much a big figure in Welsh politics over a really long period of time. So we're going to have a bit of an exit, a Big Brother style exit interview with Kirsty about her time in government, and particularly being a Liberal Democrat minister working with Labour colleagues in the Welsh government, and hopefully giving us a sense of perspective on the divergence actually between the English and Welsh systems, and some reflections on the role. So absolutely delighted to have you with us, Kirsty. We've also got Matt Hood with us. Matt is the principal of Oak National Academy, which I don't mind saying has been one of the few success stories that's come out of the Department for Education during the pandemic. Matt will no doubt talk about this himself, but you know, it really was impressive the way that Matt and what was initially a tiny team at Oak, and it's probably now still not a big enough team, was able to mobilise a huge number of teachers and experts right across the country to put together an online platform to keep kids learning during the pandemic. So as well as that, lots of you will know Matt as a Labour Party member and as a feature in discussions like this. He's got extensive experience in education, both as a school leader, governor, and is hugely passionate about education, and I know he's got lots of views about English education and where we ought to be going. So really excited to have you both with us this afternoon. Kirsty, let me start with you. So you probably had that moment to have kind of a deep breath and to start adjusting to life outside the Senedd and outside government. What for you, looking back on your time in government as the Education Minister, what would you say are the things you're most proud of during your time in government? Just unmute you.
Well, thanks, Wes, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you all today. It's been an absolute joy to be able to serve as an education minister in Wales, and to be a part of what I believe has been a very successful and stable government that was doing good things in Wales, and really came into its own in its management of the pandemic. I can't begin in some ways to verbalise the challenge that collectively we faced as a government, and clearly educating children during this time has been one of the greatest challenges that we faced after the public health emergency. And I never believed for 1 minute when I agreed to take the job in 2016 that I would be an education minister that would see me close down our education system in a face-to-face way for a significant period of time. But I'm also massively proud of the way in which the Welsh education system itself responded to that challenge. And I am in awe at the huge efforts made by the Welsh education family, both in the school settings, FE settings and university settings, to keep Wales learning during this time. So we didn't get everything right. Some bits of it weren't easy, but I think overall, I think we can be really proud of what we've been able to achieve during the pandemic, as well as over the last 5 years, the most comprehensive reform of education anywhere in the United Kingdom for over half a century.
And I mean, Kate Green and I would, when we were thinking about our response to Gavin Williamson in Westminster, we often reflected on some of the advantages that the Welsh system had, particularly because of the way in which the Conservatives have, changed the nature of assessment, that actually meant that there just wasn't the same kind of evidence base available for awarding students grades that there was in Wales. What do you think were the particular advantages for the Welsh approach to education and the choices that you made in terms of setting that reform of Welsh education versus where we are in England?
I think one of the fundamental differences is there is still a coherence in the Welsh education system, with the exception of our private, independent, fee-paying schools. The rest of our school system is a local education authority, local government provided system. So we don't have the fragmentation of free schools, of grammar schools. You know, we operate under a local education authority system where local authorities have the legal responsibility to provide education. We provide support to those local education authorities via our regional school improvement services. And then there's the government, and then of course our independent inspector. So I think there's a coherence in the sector that allows us to work closely together. I think we were. I was very fortunate to assume office when some of the thinking had been done by the previous minister, Hugh Lewis, around, for instance, the future of our curriculum. I had to make a decision whether to continue with our curriculum reform. But obviously, we've just prior to the dissolution of the Fifth Senedd passed our new curriculum and assessment bill, which fundamentally changes the way in which curricula will be developed here in Wales, how assessment will work in Wales. And then in the pandemic itself, we were able to utilise very quickly previous investment. So Matthew's here from Oak. We already had our hub learning platform that had been established for a number of years. We already had some mechanisms in place for schools to have the ability to to work remotely. We were able to move very quickly with our partners in local government to provide free school meals through the school holidays. And we did that without having to resort to a highly expensive voucher system that didn't work for families. But actually we're able to empower our local government colleagues to we provided the resources, but then they were able to decide how best those resources meet the needs of the families in their particular local area. We were able to use that partnership with local government to empty our schools of laptops and Chromebooks and iPads to get those out to children very, very quickly. I mean, there was still, I'm not for 1 minute saying that, every family was able to get the kit they needed straight away. But we were able to, and this has been, documented by independent people, we were able to get much more quick kit out much more quickly to families, as well as Wi-Fi devices for those families that had issues with connectivity. So I think we're also, the beauty of a small country is that, we can have deep partnerships with our further education providers and our universities, and then getting the system to work together across the piece, I think, has been a huge advantage. So, for instance, when we've been looking at providing online learning, our universities have been, very, very quick and very, very willing to be able to help to provide extracurricular activities, especially for those older students in preparation to go to university. So that close-knit community that we have in education in Wales, we were able to utilise those relationships to really have a strong focus on pupil and learner well-being, staff well-being, and then the infrastructure to deliver. But but it built upon, I think, those relationships that we'd worked really hard over the last 4 years to build. Crisis came, we were in a good position to be able to respond and to rely on some of the things that we had done previously. Clearly, COVID has had a huge impact, will continue to have an impact. But I hope we've laid some strong foundations, especially when we come to our new curriculum, to how we move forward in education in Wales.
Yeah, and it's really interesting here you talk about scale as well and deep partnerships. I think hopefully there'll be some interesting questions that come in on place-based education and where decision making on education and skills ought to rest. But before I bring in Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but looking in from the outside, your relationship with your Labour colleagues in the Welsh government seemed seamless from the outside. I don't find myself picking up UK newspapers and hearing about Kirsty Williams' latest bust up with Welsh Labour colleagues. Maybe you've gotten on better with colleagues in a Labour government than sometimes Labour ministers get on with colleagues in a Labour government. Is that a fair characterisation? What was it like, as you put it before we started, being the only Lib Dem in the village? And do you have any sort of regrets, things that you wish you'd been able to do but didn't get round to or couldn't get consensus on within the government?
People are always interested in this, understandably so, because it is quite a unique situation to find yourself in, being the only Liberal Democrat administration. I think the important principles for me were being able to have thought through
I think we might have some gremlins in your system there, Kirsty.
Was I had common ground couldn't be found, those differences. Oh dear, that's my rural broadband. That's one thing that we haven't solved in the Welsh government.
Well,
our rural broadband.
I'm glad it's the rural broadband and not Mark Drakeford and the team trying to pull your plug before you dish the dirt on Welsh Labour. Should we have another go? Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you fine. I'm sorry if you're not hearing me very well. Are you hearing me better now?
A bit better, yeah. We can make out what you're saying. Let's have another go, and if not, I'll bring in Matt and we'll try and bring you back in a bit.
I think what's important is to know what you're going to agree on, know what you're going to disagree on, and to have a level of trust. To have a level of trust that you can trust your colleague and trust in you, that those conversations that sometimes are difficult will be respected. And the fact that you're from a different political party will be respected on occasions, and being upfront on all that. But I think actually you're right. I think we got on very, very well. There was nothing that I was asked to vote for that I felt uncomfortable or felt that I was being disloyal to the values of my own party. I don't believe that anything that I did in the election made Labour colleagues feel uncomfortable. Perhaps pushed them a bit more than maybe they would have been pushed if they would have been known. That great favour with some Labour Party who wanted to move in that direction. And but I do think you need to be clear upfront about what you want to achieve, where those difficult points are going to be, and you have to do it from a position of trust. And I was very fortunate. I had a long relationship with the previous First Minister, and I had a very good relationship with Mark Drakeford. And I think that personal trust that you can work together and you will be able to overcome difficulties is absolutely a building block that is essential to the kind of work that we did.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Well, let's bring in Matt now. I mean, Matt, you've had a kind of, you've been right in the thick of it with this, with the pandemic. I mean, tell us a bit about, sort of what you think some of the biggest challenges are that you've had to confront during the pandemic, and also what you see now as the sort of the big issues that we ought to be focusing on as we think about recovery from the pandemic. Oh yeah, I'll just get you unmuted. There we go.
It's taken that power away from me, Wes. I'm not used to handing over so much to you.
I'm not used to having the power. Control of these buttons.
Quite right, and how we should keep it. Thanks for having me. For those of you who don't know, Oak National Academy is a government-backed national online school. We've delivered about 130 million lessons over the past year. At the height of the most recent lockdown, we had about 2.5 million pupils a week taking part in lessons with us. I suppose the biggest challenge, I think, over the past 12 months, particularly for school leaders, has been trying to understand or anticipate what the next move that they're having to make is likely to be, and to be able to put things in place in order to be able to make that move at sufficient time. And I do really feel for political leaders across the spectrum in some of these roles. I am critical of particular decisions all over the place, but again, appreciate that they are often getting information very late as well. But if I just take my own school, where I'm chair of governors, just over a year ago, we were a school. What that meant was children turned up, they went to lessons. We did some peripheral stuff around the edges. They played a bit of football or a bit of netball or did something else, and then they largely went home. We have a breakfast club, so we fed them in the morning and we fed them all at lunchtime, and that was sort of our bread and butter. If you were to go into our building today, we are a school for kids who are in the building. We are a school for kids when they're not in the building. We are a test and trace centre. Remember, schools did the vast majority of their own test and trace work. So we have a whole system set up to call people if there is a case and someone needs to isolate. We are a testing centre. So we have a sports hall which can do large volumes of lateral flow tests. And although we did some community work, the scale of that has increased exponentially. We are give out vouchers for the local food bank. We provided clothes. We were making PPE kits. This is 12 months. The leaders of this school have transformed this thing that was in a building where children went to lessons into this institution that went way beyond. I think the job that school leaders have taken on is genuinely remarkable over that period of time. And I don't think the kind of operational complexity quite makes it through into the discourse. There are 23,000 people who basically kept their communities running. And when particularly you look at England and you look into some of those communities, actually the only really community asset that is left existing in lots of those places is the school. Right, there are GP surgeries, but apart from GP on a hyper-local level, like the school is the institution left standing. Kirsty drew out one of, I think, the real weaknesses of the English education system in tackling this pandemic, which is its decentralized, fragmented nature. And for those of you who've been on these sorts of things, you'll have heard me banging on many times before about the need to stop in England trying to run two simultaneous education systems, one of local authority maintained schools and one of academies. I don't say that as someone who is not in favour of the academies. I think that reform was essential, and Andrew Adonis's work to kick it off was essential. But we're well over 10 years into that now, and saying that structures don't matter is one of the things that actually Tony Blair, coming out of government, said that going in he thought and coming out he definitely didn't. Structures do matter, and they particularly matter in moments of crisis like this one. I think the job for education systems all over the world coming out of the pandemic is figuring out how to, some people call it catch up, some people call it recovery, whatever you want to call it, how we tackle this particular challenge. And if, as per the title of the session here, we are trying to figure out how to make this the best place in the world for children to grow up, that means we have to make also this the best place in the world to be a teacher. And the thing that matters above all else is the expertise of the teacher. I am reasonably brutal on Labour education policy on education in England over the past, and actually occasionally in Wales over the past decade, because of its lack of focus and conversation about some of these issues, particularly teacher development and teacher expertise. Yes, 70% of what affects outcomes for pupils happens outside of the school gates, but we have 30% to play with in schools, and I will take my 30% and I want to do something important with it. And so, yes, with your new hat on, Wes, you can tackle that 70% because a lot of that is about child poverty. But with your former hat on and now Pete Carl's hat on, like, what are we going to do about that 30%? And I think we've been absent from the debate. And I think the evidence that we've used in that debate is often too thin. And we've got to get into that more because the Conservatives are stealing a march on us. Yeah, so I mean, the best place in the world to be a teacher, you'll find in my a number of speeches I gave during my period as Shadow Schools Minister, and I'm sure, not least because we share an office, they'll be winging their way into Peter Carl's speech as the new Shadow Schools Minister. I think that point is very well made.
some of what you said there will be considered heresy to some sections of the Labour Party, although it's fair to say when I've been going around to constituency Labour parties talking about structures, I think lots of party members, including those that were implacably opposed to the Academies programme, recognise that by the time of the next Labour government, hopefully after the next general election, especially if Gavin Williamson follows through on his plans to roll out further academisation, the school system is going to look completely different, and certainly very different to the system that Kirsty's described in Wales. So thinking about that as the starting point, the system we inherit, what should Labour do? And what should structural reform of the English education system look like in order to, you know, live Labour values and, most importantly, unlock the potential of every child in the country?
So the Academies programme was introduced for a very, very specific reason. Academies solve one problem. They solve a problem of dual failure. When you have a local authority, when you have a school that is underperforming, largely this is a school often serving low-income families, the sorts of families that we're supposed to be representing, and you have a failing local authority that is not able to help the school improve. And in England, under the last Labour government, you know, when I started teaching, you know, my school had 6% of kids got 5 good GCSEs in maths and English. Like, that is appalling. And we should be ashamed of overseeing a system where 9 children left with a clutch of GCSEs that allow them to only move on to the next basic move. We're not talking about going to Oxford or Cambridge here. We're talking about like getting a place in a college. What the Academies movement did is it stopped those schools failing by taking them out of the control of the local authority and placing them with another administrative organisation. Now, the system that we're in now in England is about 50% of kids are educated in academies, about 50% are educated in maintained schools. I actually don't care whether you're in an academy or a maintained school. That isn't the thing that makes a difference. But what we have got to do is we have got to come up with an answer to the question of how do we move the system from where it is forward into a system that doesn't replicate this problem of dual failure. So anybody who's sat here saying what we should do is take all the schools back to local authorities. I mean, one, like the legal complexity of that is like insane. Like we would just never, we would spend all year fighting with lawyers to be able to do it. But you know, there are features of maintained schools that are really good. There are features of academies that are really good. We just, sorry to steal a Donald Trump-esque line here, but we just need to make schools again. There needs to be an institution and it needs to be called a school. Like, I don't think it should be run day-to-day by local authorities, but should local authorities have a role in the coordination and planning and oversight of schools in their areas? Yeah, I think that's a really obvious thing to do. And in times of crisis, should local authorities be a coordinating body that deal with getting food and laptops and all kinds of other things out? Yes, they should. And should they help to coordinate things that don't make sense to be done at the individual school level, like special and additional needs provision? Yes, but does it mean that the local authority has to maintain the school? No, I don't think that that's what makes the difference. So you can Google me and find extensive writing on this thing that we call system governance, or the middle tier. It's a super techie, nerdy issue in English education. I have been making the case for tidying this bit of the system up for 10 years. But if the Labour position is like, we hate academies, when 50% of kids are educated in them and the vast majority of secondary school kids are educated in them, and we don't have an understanding of where the system needs to go and how we're going to improve it, like, we're just spending so much time debating this issue, and what we're not having a conversation about is improving the expertise of teachers so that they can improve outcomes for kids, and we get a better system overall.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I thought actually in the last few years, Angela Rayner did a very good job as Shadow Education Secretary of avoiding some of those traps for the Labour Party, even when there was, I think, a natural expectation that Labour would kind of lead into that position when Jeremy Corbyn was leader. Well, let's start bringing in some questions from our audience now. You can send them into Kira, who will then pass them on to me. The first question I've got for you both, and again, I think this helps to draw out some of the differences between the English and Welsh system. Clearly, there's a huge amount of concern at the moment in England, and you know, Kirsty, tell us what the picture is in Wales, but in England, loads of staff and students and parents are really worried about how we're going to award grades. And the people also looking ahead to next year's exams and worried about what that will look like. Do you think that the Tory government made a big mistake in dropping coursework, modular examinations, AS levels? We've had loads of questions on this particular coursework. And do you think that Labour's policy in England should be to bring some of that back? Kirsty, I'll bring you in first.
Oh, thank you. Well, initially last year, we thought the ability to use our AS grades to be able to award A2 grades would help us. As you know, as everywhere else in the UK, our system fell over. But I did think, I genuinely think having the presence of those AS grades is an advantage. I also think the presence of the AS grades is something that is helpful from a university sense. And I think when we're talking about children from more deprived backgrounds, perhaps who are non-traditional potential students of HE, I think AS levels are also really helpful, because we know that there's a tendency for people to look for lower tariff or courses or lower tariff universities. But that ability to sit an AS grade to demonstrate that you are really very, very good actually then allows you to move on. And of course, in Wales, we've also put in place our Seren Academy that looks to provide a wraparound service for children to look to move on to higher tariff courses and universities. I think our coursework mixture, is really important, because it allows students who learn in different styles to demonstrate different levels of expertise. And some of those parts of our examination system, qualification system that we've kept hold of, I think are skills that demonstrate, employability skills. So for instance, there's still an emphasis on speaking skills in our English. Your ability to write, yes, but actually your ability to verbally communicate with people is something that's really important. Now, we are reviewing our qualifications as a result of our curriculum reform, because we can't go through the big curriculum reform that we're about to go through in Wales and then have very traditional GCSE A-level GCSE subjects. So we're looking at the moment to reform qualifications. I hope that we'll take a really expansive and a really challenging look at that, because I think the way in which we award qualifications, I think is part of the challenge. And we set schools up and we judge schools, in a way purely on a very narrow set of statistics rather than a all-round performance. Now, clearly qualifications are vitally important to those young people, but a school has got to be about more than that. So I think, but can I just absolutely agree with Matt about teaching. So we know the quality of teaching, the quality of leadership is key. So we have radically reformed our initial teacher education programme. We're able to introduce further reforms to post-qualification support and learning for our teachers. And over 3 years, we've seen the biggest financial investment in teacher professional learning than we have ever seen in the history of devolution. That money's been given to head teachers and given to schools so that they can have bespoke professional learning for their individual members of staff. And we've also set up a National Academy of Educational Leadership, because one of the things that we've been very poor at in Wales is actually supporting leadership in our system. We've been very, 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 very poor at, and we've created the Academy to support leaders in the system to be the very best that we can be. COVID has interfered in some of that work, because we were also looking at how you different for progression in the teaching profession. And Professor McWhorter, who Matt might know, was advising the government on how we could look at, again, career progression, early career support for teachers, those crucial years which can make and break a teaching professional. They either leave, and that's a real waste. So we've had a very strong emphasis over the last 5 years of reforming initial teacher education. We've got a new master's programme starting in September, new academy for leadership to support leadership, and lots and lots of money for the first time ever in professional learning, which has been devolved down to schools, so schools can really look at professional learning that really meets the needs of their individuals and delivered in a very different way. No more sending your member of staff to Cardiff who sits in a room all day to listen to the sage on the stage, who then goes back to school, and then nothing changes in school. So, you know, a much more, I believe, much more effective use of professional learning opportunities.
Thanks, Kirsty. Matt?
So I like exams. I like exams a lot. And I think that we are about to see, for anybody who is against fair, valid external assessment, we're about to see in the English education system what the consequences of romantic ideas about solely using teacher assessment end up doing. And my prediction this year is that the gap between poor children and their wealthier peers on performance is going to widen very significantly, because what we've done is we've asked about 3,500 schools to become awarding bodies based on a range of unreliable, uncomparable assessments between different children. And if you were to imagine the sorts of parents that we have in our system and which ones are likely to advocate strongest for a higher grade for their children, and which schools in our system are likely to cave to the pressure from sharp-elbowed parents about the grades that are being awarded in our system, I don't think it takes you that long to realise that private school heads are going to come under an enormous amount of probably financial pressure from their parents to award their children high grades, and parents who are working multiple jobs and don't have the wherewithal and resources to come in and advocate to me in quite the same way as a chair of governors at school for their children are going to find themselves missing out. What we have to remember as the Labour Party is that if we don't set fair ways of assessing the performance of pupils, society will step in and provide alternative ways of distributing opportunities. Those alternative ways are unpaid internships. They are various types of other social mechanisms, what you look like, how you sound, and they are not the sorts of things that a high quality, carefully designed, externally administered, fair assessment allows you to do. There is this narrative inside the Labour Party that examinations are unfair and disadvantage children from low-income families. And I think that is entirely wrong. And I think we're about to see that play out live in the English education system this year. I think this is going to be the best advocate for a combination of exams and coursework. I'm not against in places where it's appropriate in the curriculum for teachers to do some coursework-based assessment and that to be moderated. But I think we're about to see our poor children massively damaged by a entirely teacher-based assessment. And I think we're about to see school leaders and indeed teachers workload, heaven forbid, like litigation, certainly conflict with parents about how examinations, how grades are going to be awarded this year, to be a big challenge. It feels like a kind of compelling lefty thing to say that you don't like these assessments. I don't know why that is, but I think it's total nonsense. And the sooner we are back to a system that is a level playing field for all kids, regardless of their background, in my view, the better. Does that mean like teach to the test? No. Does it mean design a really carefully well thought through knowledge-rich curriculum that allows kids to learn about the best of what has been thought and said and painted and danced and sung and then assessed against what they know about that? Yes, and we can do that, and we should be doing that as a Labour Party. If we continue scrapping Ofsted and SATs and examinations, what happens is poor kids in the system continue to go to poor schools that don't do what they're supposed to do for them, and we just have no idea where those kids are, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So yeah, strong views there, Wes, as you already know.
Now people know what I've had in my ear for the last in the school's job. So we've had quite a few questions about specific policies and policies that have either featured in recent manifestos or have certainly been policies that people have pushed towards Labour to embracing. So what do you think about ending, I'll take these in a group of three, ending the charitable status for private schools, scrapping university tuition fees, and what was the other one? Let's see if I can find it here. There was and restoring the bursaries for initial teacher training, which the Tories did away with. Who wants to go? Who wants to take those first? Because see Matt chomping at the bit at some of those, but Kirsty, how about you? Let's bring you in first.
Well, the Welsh Government did have a consultation on ending the charitable status of independent schools. That work was knocked off track by COVID. So that was something that the Welsh Government was actively pursuing. My colleague Rebecca Evans, the Finance Minister, was actively pursuing that. In terms of tuition fees, well, it's a beautiful thought, and clearly, you know, in an ideal world, that's what you would do. But you know, we looked at this very, very carefully in Wales via the Diamond Review, and I believe that what we've come up with and our reforms since 2016 are give us in Wales the most progressive system of student support anywhere in the United Kingdom. And for those people who are unfamiliar, and I forgive if teaching grandma to suck eggs, but here in Wales, you take out a loan to pay your tuition. But every student receives a grant of £1,000 because we recognise there is benefit to the state as well as to the individual of going on to higher education. And then we means test for grants. So the average Welsh student attending a university, whether that be anywhere in the United Kingdom, gets a grant, a non-repayable grant of over £7,000 a year. That's your average Welsh student. We also make that support available for postgraduate study, because, you know, that's the next big leap in terms of, you know, education progression, and where your bank of mum and dad is really able to help you out if you want to stay on to do postgraduate stuff. And crucially for us as well, it's also available for part-time study. And since we introduced these reforms in where we have seen a massive increase in the number of people who are studying for a degree on a part-time basis, predominantly through the Open University. Not so much progress in our traditional universities, but in terms of the Open University, we have seen a massive increase. So last year, we've seen the biggest proportion of students from our poorest backgrounds go on to HE, because it is those upfront living costs, it's the ability to sustain yourself through higher education that is the real barrier. So, you know, if you're going to, you can get rid of tuition fees like they have in Scotland, but in Scotland you have a system where you have a cap on numbers, which is absolute death for social progression. So the type of people who go on to the university are the people whose mums and dads went to university and grandparents went to university. So you have to have give in the system. It is those upfront costs, and, you know, yes, people are leaving, you know, with student loans, but those loans aren't being paid back until you're earning a certain amount of money, and therefore our focus on upfront costs and making sure that people have grants, I think, is a progressive part of the HE funding system anywhere in the United Kingdom, especially when you see that we're doing it for postgraduate and part-timers as well. So I'm, you know, and we did it, massive change, and we did it without anybody burning an of me or the First Minister outside the Senate building, because we made the case for change. And it's allowed us the money that it's to reprioritize some money back into the universities themselves, because under the old system, where we were very generous to the individual student, we were absolutely denuding our institutions of funding. And from a national perspective, that's really bad. So what you had is very well funded Welsh students going elsewhere to university to better funded institutions, because we were denuding funding to our own. In terms of nation building, strength of our own nation, you know, the ability to put more money into HE, into the institutions to improve their, you know, their offer has been really important. It's one of the proudest things I think that I'm involved in over the last 5 years.
That's great. And I must say on the part-time participation in particular, my goodness, a stark contrast to what we've seen in England, which is part-time and mature participation just fall off a cliff. Been really depressing. So well, that's really interesting, actually, a really interesting path and model for us to look at. So Matt, where do you stand on these three issues?
So I'm an economics teacher by training. That's my my trade, and so these are just all questions of opportunity costs, cost foregone, where you're going to spend your money. On private schools, if you're wanting to raise some money, it won't be huge amounts, but if you're wanting to raise some money, removing the charitable status of private schools is a way of doing it. I have no particular objection to that, and I think that it's a stretch to suggest that some of our private school institutions are doing charitable work in the traditional sense of a charity. We do have to be careful, though, as the Labour Party, of what parents think and what the wider public thinks about these things. You can look vindictive, and we need to be very careful about that. But I think the case for charitable status of private schools is sketchy at best, and definitely worth a look. On tuition fees, I totally agree with Kirsty, and I think the Welsh model here is has been really well thought through. Fewer poor kids go to university in Scotland, even though it's free. That's partly because there's caps, and it's also partly because standards in Scottish schools aren't high enough, which means that kids don't get the grades to get into their universities. So if you want to widen participation, you need to not have these caps, and we need standards in state schools in Scotland to be higher than they currently are. I don't want to be spending any more money on HE until it's a level playing field with FE. We can't continue to complain that the 50% of kids that don't go to university who take an FE route aren't getting a fair deal when we spend significantly more on kids who go to HE than we do kids who go to FE. On my opportunity cost scale, I think that universities are doing okay, and I think colleges need more help and support, and so I would be spending it there. On bursaries, again, I think lots of the same sorts of things that we talk about when we're talking about access to university apply to access to professional courses. What I don't want is a situation where if you don't have mum or dad, or you can't stay at their house, you can't afford to join a particular profession because the barriers to entry into that profession prevent you from doing so. But again, we need to be sensible. We train about 40,000 teachers a year in England. That's roughly the same size as the Royal Navy, to give people some idea of the sort of shape and size of that. And the numbers applying to do that go up and down each year, largely in line with the economy. We're doing okay this year because there's no other jobs. In times when the economy is booming, we really struggle. So I have no issue with providing incentives, particularly for people with maths and science backgrounds who can command higher wages in other bits of the economy. I've no objection to giving them a little sweetener to help them consider joining one of the best professions in the world. And I've no objection at times when we don't need to spend that money going down. What I do object to is if you want to be a teacher, you not being able to do so because you've come out of university and want to join a profession, and you can't afford to do it through one of those through one of the main traditional routes for doing so. So if you want to raise a bit of money, yep, go after the charitable status of private schools. If you want to spend a bit of money, I wouldn't spend it on tuition fees, and I'd only spend it on bursaries if we've got a shortage of teachers in those subjects.
And you mentioned vocational education, Matt, and the importance of investing in FE. What do you think of the government's proposed T levels and how that's going to go?
Two interesting career history things. So I was a civil servant inside of the Department for Education for a little while. I actually worked for Ed Balls' administration, then Michael Gove, and then in fact Sarah Tether. So I've done the full spin of education ministers. In fact, I was working for Sarah Tether when the tuition fees bill was going through, and I had to hide her behind me as we tried to run from Parliament to Portcullis House to stop her literally being mobbed by the protesters outside. A very tough day. The last Labour government was rolling out a programme of something called Diplomas. T-levels look terrifyingly similar to diplomas to me, with a slightly different name attached to the front of them. I think what we need to stop trying to do is run this story that we need to make everything equivalent to each other. Things will be equivalent to each other when middle-class parents start sending their kids to high-quality FE colleges, and until that's the case, like, these things aren't going to have the same standard effect. And people point to Germany all the time on this one, and actually that's not the case in Germany. It's a bit of a myth. What we need is really well-funded, really high-quality teaching and learning in FE colleges in exactly the same way that we need them in the school. We have this slightly weird conception as kids move from compulsory schooling at 16 into FE 16 to 18 into university 18 onwards, that somehow their cognitive infrastructure changes over the summer holiday between one year and another, that the type of teaching and learning that you need in an FE college or a university is somehow different because, I don't know, the summer went by. Discovery learning as a concept doesn't work for 5-year-olds, it doesn't work for 12-year-olds, it also doesn't work for 16-year-olds, and it doesn't work for 18-year-olds either. We need high quality evidence-informed teaching and learning at every single one of those stages. And I think what's happened is that that is happening in schools, and that conversation is happening in schools, and it's not happening in FE, and it's certainly not happening in HE.
And Kirsty, what's your perspective on this question?
We've got some real concerns about the practicality of the T-levels operating in a Welsh system. So, but we have to be mindful that, as there is divergence in the system and there is divergence in qualifications, those qualifications still need to be portable, because no parent is going to thank a Welsh government for creating a qualification that doesn't have currency and isn't portable. I absolutely agree with Matt about issue around this parity of esteem question, which is never cracked. And you're absolutely right. Until we see children from all kinds of backgrounds making those different decisions about the nature of their post-16 education, that parity of esteem isn't going to happen. So what do we do about that? So we've been looking at how do you improve information and advice at school, and how do you not only provide that for children, but how do you provide that for parents? And actually, how do you create a system where that competition, because money follows the student, where schools are inadvertently, not giving good advice or support, or laying out the entire range of options to students because they want to keep them with them. So one of the things, unfortunately, that fell foul of the COVID situation was our tertiary reforms that we were trying to do here in Wales with a new bill that looked to create a single overarching strategic body for the planning of post-16 education in Wales. And that would be sixth forms, work-based learning, apprenticeships, FE colleges, HE, to create a much more holistic system. We can't afford the competition, we can't afford the duplication, and to have a system that allowed students to much more easily move between different parts of the system at different points in their life, and to make sure that there was that focus on quality experiences and quality teaching, and a quality framework that would help measure success and allow us to plan strategically in those places. Unfortunately, because we published the bill in draft form, the frustrating thing for me is some of the stuff that we've seen coming out of Westminster is actually copying what we wanted to do. And because of COVID, they're going to get a march on us, which is a bit cross about, really, because I'm going to claim that we thought of it first. But I really hope that the new minister will pick up the draft bill and run with it, because forces of conservatism would like to see everything stay the same. Thank you very much. If you're a university, you quite like the fact that you've got a little funding council all of your own, and you don't have to, see yourself as part of that wider system. But actually having an overall body that says, no, actually you are part of a wider system, and we have to look at how we strategically plan all of these opportunities, and nobody gets hived off to have a special arrangement for themselves, but you're part of a wider infrastructure of post-16 qualifications, training and learning opportunities. I hope that Jeremy, who was on before us, I know, on the 1 o'clock session, I hope that he will Well, we'll stick to my guns anyway, and do the bill.
Well, I'm conscious of time, and at 3 o'clock we're back in the breakout session to hear from Peter Mandelson, which will be great, because you know, he rarely matches the sort of the pantomime villain that we read about in the newspapers, and he'll have lots of interesting things to say. But I'm really keen just to hear from both of you in terms of sort of final thoughts, and picking up another theme that's come through in the questions. You know, thinking about the future, and you know, some of what the pandemic has perhaps taught us, or made us start to sort of really think about for the better in terms of the future. What do you think we should be sort of prioritising in terms of thinking about the role of technology in the future of education, different modes of assessment, and teaching and learning, particularly online? What role does that have? And finally, on a more sort of philosophical level, particularly in an era of sort of fake news and, you know, deep fakes, and you know, just reading in today's newspapers the extent to which sort of online conspiracy theories are, you know, now even changing local election results. What do you think that means for the education system? So I realise that's not really a kind of, and finally, really quickly, what do you think of all this? Kirsty?
Well, what I hope that we've learned from the pandemic is the value of schools and the importance of the teaching profession. As Matt said at the beginning, they are often the linchpin of a community, and they do so much more, as we have discovered. And I really hope we can build on the communication that undoubtedly has increased between schools and parents. We've had a small pot of money in Wales under the Community Focused Schools Fund, and I hope that we can increase that work and really, really empower schools to play the role, a wider role within their communities, but to have that supported by a range of other agencies, so it doesn't just fall on the teaching profession. I really hope that that on the fake news stuff, the first part of our new curriculum that we've introduced ahead of everything else is digital competency. When we talk about digital competency, we don't just talk being able to use, you know, software on a computer, but it is to be able to have those skills to be able to engage as a citizen in the world that we're in at the moment, and to understand, when you're living your life as you do, how you keep yourself well, how you keep yourself safe, and how you're able to interpret what you are reading, you know. And it's absolutely crucial. There's a common refrain in my house. I have 3 teenage girls, and one of the worst things I ever did was to teach my farmer husband how to use a computer and how to go on Facebook. And quite often the refrain around the dinner table is, "Dad, you should not believe everything that you read on Facebook." So we've got to equip our children with those critical thinking skills to be really able to interpret what they're reading, and then act as agents of change within their own families, to be able to challenge the older people in their lives about how they are interacting with some of this technology. But I hope we appreciate more than perhaps we've done in the past the importance of teaching, the complexity of the job that our teachers do, and the vital role that those schools are playing in their community, because they're not just teaching children, they're doing so much more for them.
Absolutely. Matt, final thoughts from you? Oh, you've muted yourself, haven't you? Well, that's your own fault. I'll unmute you. There we go.
Sorry, a habit on these things to keep muting. So I think the comprehensive education system in England celebrated its 150th birthday this year. I don't know if that's the same in other nations, but I'm pretty sure I've read that somewhere in England. The thing that we are still facing down the barrel of is that 150 years in, we still have not figured out how to make sure 100% of our pupils leave primary education able to read. We had 150 years to try to figure out the answer to this question, and we figured out the answer. Like, we know how to do this. The problem is we still are not able to implement uniformly across the system to the standard that we require. And I think the thing that the pandemic has exposed is that political discourse, particularly around education, and it's come through from some of the questions that you've asked, is often about what the big next idea is. Well, the future's coming, and you know, what we're going to do about this, and like technology. And I say this is like someone running an online school. Like, online schools are not the answer. EdTech is not the answer. The answer to this question is the Labour Party getting back interested in the detail and the hard work of ruthless implementation to raise standards. And that is not quick, that is not easy. And the thing that I think we can most learn from our Welsh colleagues is what was really hard about that for the past 10 years. And we've heard some of that from Kirsty today. What were the like difficult compromises that you came across? Where was it working in your system and where wasn't it working? What did you do to calibrate where it wasn't working to kind of put something in to make it a little bit better? Like, it is understandable like where we are in the political cycle and where the Labour Party is in its attempt to empower. But for those people working in the system, what they want to hear from the Labour Party is what practically it is going to do to raise those standards, and what are those standards that it wants to see. And it wants it to move away from, as you've been pushing for, scrap this and bin that, and this big thing about like, let's try and get 100% of kids reading. Like, we know how to do it. There's really extensive research, like some schools get 100%. Like, how do we get all schools 100%? How do we get all kids fed in schools? How do we do some of these very difficult practical things of implementation? And the best place to learn from that is our colleagues in Wales who have been trying to do some of this stuff. And, you know, Kirsty and I disagree on some ideas. Like, I don't think the answer is teaching critical thinking. I don't think you can teach critical thinking. That's a debate for another time. But what Kirsty and I can agree on is, like, it's hard doing this stuff. Spinning up a school in a year is really, really hard. It takes a lot of hours of hard grind. And I think inside the Labour Party, we have become not interested enough in the work of doing, and we need to get back to it.
Well, that is a really great challenge, a gauntlet laid down for us to end on. This has been a brilliant session. I've been really looking forward to it, and it has not disappointed in any way. And I think the fact we've had over 70 people tuned in from beginning to end, I think is a testament to the quality of the conversation that we've had. So thank you, both of you. Particularly thanks to you, Matt, as I know you've got so much going on with your schools and with Oak, and also Kirsty. I mean, you know, you've tried to leave this all behind, and you've come to speak to a Labour audience to boot. And I can see why you're held in such high regard by so many colleagues in Welsh Labour. So thank you very much for what you did in government and for sharing that with us this afternoon. It's so appreciated. And now it's time for us all to head over to plenary to join Peter Mandelson. And I've just popped the link in the chat for you, so I'll see you there. Thanks, everyone. That's been great.